Hello and welcome to my lecture review using the JBL book, Risk Management Fundamentals. This book is written by Gibson and Andy Igonor. It's again, Managing Risk in Information Systems, 3rd edition. It is a Jones and Bartlett book, ISBN number 9781284183719. Again, they own all the copyrights. All I am doing is preparing lecture review for the PowerPoints that they own the rights to. So with that said, let's jump in and let's see what we can do. Chapter 6, Performing a Risk Assessment. So in this module, we're going to be describing the components of effective risk assessment to an organization. We're going to be looking at key things such as the steps involved in risk assessment, identifying assets, threats, vulnerabilities, evaluating controls, selecting the appropriate methodology, and developing a risk mitigation recommendation process. All right, so selecting a risk assessment methodology. There's more than a few types, so this is definitely a process that is developed over time. You need to identify assets and activities to be addressed. That then drives the ability to identify and evaluate the relevant threats to the identified assets and activities. That will drive into identify and evaluate relevant vulnerabilities. So this one will be relevant threats, then vulnerabilities. Once we've identified threats and vulnerabilities for the assets and activities, then we can identify and evaluate relevant controls to prevent the threats from realizing those vulnerabilities. We can look at that through the lens of assessing the threats, vulnerabilities, and exploits, and again, making sure that the exploits do not realize the vulnerability. That allows us to evaluate risk and define some type of risk matrix and quantify our risk at this point. From here, we can then provide recommendations for mitigating the identified risks, and then from there, identify our risk mitigation and other recommendations to management. So what we have to do is we need to define the assessment. What are the functional requirements? What are the operational characteristics? What are the focus? What's the mission? What's the objective? Once we do that, then we can review any of previous findings, look at the previous assessments, recommendations, mitigation recommendations, and we can identify if anything's been changed, modified, adjusted, and that gives us a nice starting point. What's the current status of accepted recommendation? Did all previous items that were found, all previous identified risk, were they actually mitigated? Were they verified? Was there a process that allowed us to go back and double check? Were there any unapproved recommendations that were actually implemented? So selecting the assessment could also be looking at the configuration. A single mail server. So if we have things coming in, or we have the internal network trying to access the configuration for the email server, we might also want a firewall here. The server also provides services that both internal and external, but the illustration is old and doesn't reflect the current configuration. Maybe we identified that internal threats or internal users might access it, and that might have been a threat, hence the firewall modification. But right now, if we just have this component, we don't know anything else. So we might have, I don't know why they did 2 email servers. We could have the email server that's serving both internal and external, but we have a firewall, and the email server is within our DMZ. That's appropriate. So we need to identify the structure. So we need to refer to how responsibilities were assigned, and how large is the organization? Again, we need to be mindful of the scope and the ownership of the management and of the entity or organization. The larger organizations might have a varying level of complexity. Infrastructure, end-device management, servers, configuration management. There's a lot more things within a larger organization because they might have multiple divisions and additional resources to actually aid in appropriate separation and segmentation and best practice for overall structure. So when we're looking at our assets, we can also look at boundaries. So when we're looking at our asset, we need to do an evaluation. Replacement costs. We need to see what our risk assessment allows us to identify on the current system and how that allows us to figure out appropriate cost. And it does allow us to categorize and prioritize our assets. Elements to consider when determining assets is access availability, functionality requirements, hardware and software, personnel, data, and facilities. If we have backup facilities, hot site, warm site, things like that. All of these need to be in the plan so that we can prioritize correctly, because all of this is going to be tied back to a cost, and at a certain point, the business has to function and the technology has to support that, but it has to be within an appropriate cost. So here we have other boundaries. So here we have data coming in, we have a firewall, appliance for spam, email server, and that's it. So the spam filter might filter out as much as, 30-ish% of the spam. And so it is placed between the internet or network connectivity and the email server. That way data flows through it and we're able to reduce the spam getting to the email server. If we look at the costs of the spam server and we look at the potential for what the spam could do on the email server, we can see if the risk is acceptable and then figure out cost from there. Again, here is our threats and vulnerability matrix. Our threats lead to attack. The attack will target a vulnerability that should have some type of loss or impact. So again, there is a evaluation and identification for relevant threats, the potential for attack. The attack will have to exploit the vulnerability or realize the vulnerability, and there will typically end up with a impact or loss to the organization, typically resulting in some form of cost. How do we do this? Historical data or trends. Trends within our own organization, trends within the industry, really just depends. Historical data could be attacks, natural disasters, accidents, equipment and equipment failure, threat modeling, that will be looking at the modeling for the systems, architecture, hardware, software, the threat profile, and an analysis. We need to understand how the individual threats will interact with the potential vulnerability so we can identify the risk and understand how the threats and vulnerabilities will interact with the measured risk. So there is a process to evaluate so we can quantify. So you have to understand that vulnerabilities are a weakness, and an exploit will exploit or realize that weakness. And the weakness could be a physical, technical, operational, managerial, administrative. It could be many types of weaknesses that are realized. Everything have vulnerabilities. Not all vulnerabilities result in loss. Not all vulnerabilities are easily able to be spotted. The big thing here is we have to identify what vulnerabilities are there and then figure out how to rank them, prioritize, and mitigate the ones that are going to result in a loss. So they're used to discover weaknesses in a system. That's the point of a vulnerability assessment. It also allows us to prioritize vulnerabilities to see which ones are the most likely and which ones have a weakness that are most relevant that might be exploited. This can be performed inside the network or outside the network, or internal staff or external staff. It really just depends. The assessment goals are identify critical details of core functions of technology systems, to identify the vulnerabilities in those technologies, in the controls and things like that. You can use Nmap or Nessus as assessment tools to collect data. So the exploit assessment will look at assessing the exploits, looking at the vulnerabilities, looking at how the attackers will exploit that vulnerability. What will happen after a weakness is discovered? Is there an intrusion? What's the goal? And can you test the exploit? And again, you should normally do this if we're doing this ethically. You're going to have authorization with permission. But you can identify gaps so that you can then figure out appropriate mitigation techniques. And that includes identifying and evaluating controls to help aid in mitigation. So in-place controls, what are already currently there inside the operating system, inside the software, inside the applications. Planned controls, that will be the planning documents. It could be dates, it could be timelines, or there could be control categories. SIS or SANS Top 20, NIST standards, classes that have families of controls, as well as, so this is always really interesting, we could have admin, managerial, or procedural, or, comma, technical/logical, comma, physical, depending on which book you're reading. Procedural could be managerial or administrative, technical could be technical or logical, and then physical would be the last type of control. Those are the three main types. So procedural, administrative, managerial, those are going to be the policies, the procedures, the guidelines, the planning, things like that. Technical or logical, that's going to be the technology-based control. Physical controls will be the locks, the lights, the cameras, CCTVs, things like that. When we're looking at being able to identify controls, we can look at the methodology, quantitatively, qualitatively. Quantitatively have a statistics or quantifiable function. Qualitatively are things going to be not as easily measured. Brand reputation is going to be more qualitative. Loss is going to be more quantitative. So once we identify how we're going to deal with the methodology based off the risk we're trying to measure, we can then figure out how to develop our mitigation plan. Because depending on what we're measuring and how we're measuring it, our mitigation plan is going to be different based off of the metrics. So once we perform our analysis, we have to find recommendations for our mitigation. We normally try to link threats and vulnerability pairs so they're put together. We do try to figure out costs So we can do a cost-benefit analysis. We also try to estimate operational cost, and again, the cost for it. And all of this is tied back to that CBA. Everything goes back to money. The business has to operate. That means we need to effectively, dealing with the cost component, figure out a way to get the most bang for the buck. We need to present our risk assessment results, and normally that's done through some form of plan of action and milestones. And again, that's a living, breathing document that you will actually work through multiple. You will present your recommendation and develop a plan of action. Best practices for this entire process is to ensure systems are fully as described based off of what your contract states. Review past logs and audits. Do your review all past risk assessments reviewed for completionist sake. Match risk assessment to management structure. Identify the boundaries. Identify and evaluate threats, vulnerabilities. Tie them to controls. Track the results. Repeat when and as necessary. All right, that's the end of this chapter. If you have any questions, concerns, thoughts, or issues, please let me know. Thank you. Alrighty, well, thank you. That concludes this lecture review. Again, all material presented in this PowerPoint lecture was copyrighted by Jones and Bartlett Learning. So they own the copyright. I am just providing a lecture on the PowerPoints that they provided. With that said, if you have any questions, thoughts, issues, concerns, please feel free to reach out to me, leave a comment, get in touch with me, and I will get those addressed as quickly as I can. Thank you.